Just to start with the welcome to everybody. Today's webinar is on tips for presenting at PhUSE events. My name is John Moon. I'm part of the EU Connect conference committee. I'm not going to go into any more detail about myself. I'll do that later on in the presentation, and there's a particular reason for that. I'm going to introduce to you a new concept that we're using this year, which is the introduction slide. So bear with me and I'll talk a little bit about myself later on in the presentation. I want to then introduce to you a couple of concepts to begin with in terms of how I'm going to run the presentation. Basically, as I go through it, I'm going to bring up some slides, and you will see on the right-hand side, this kind of traffic lighting effect will come up, which will indicate to you whether the slide could be improved or not. So don't worry about anything that's on the slide, any context for these slides. This is just a slide with a lot of text on it. And what I'm saying here is this isn't the best way of doing things with putting so much text on it. So red traffic lighting says it could be better. Green traffic lighting says this is potentially a better way of doing things. And I'm not saying this is the only way of doing things. What I'm doing today is just introducing concepts and tips. So for me, my disclaimer for this presentation is listen to what I have to say, but I'm not an expert. I don't believe I'm necessarily a brilliant presenter. I've researched the topic over the last while, put together what I think are slides that are relevant. My experience on the PhUSE conference committees over the years has given me insight into what works for a presentation and what doesn't. But at the end of the day, it's up to you. You look at the presentation, you can take from it what you want and implement exactly what you feel works best for you. The third concept in terms of the traffic lighting I'm going to introduce is this yellow color, which basically is information. It's just here for information purposes. And again, for this particular slide, the information is I'm not going to be covering anything specific to posters. Obviously, this is tips about presenting. And yes, posters are presented as well. But this session is more focused on the likes of PowerPoint presentations. If you are presenting a poster, there are guidelines on the PhUSE website. There's the poster guidance document, and then there's the poster template. So again, that's the third concept that you will see throughout the slides. So for the agenda today, it's slightly different from the agenda that was sent out in the invite to the webinar, more or less the same. What I'm going to go through is topics around preparing for your presentation. Items around the structure, the general structure that you should have within your presentation. The bulk of what I'm going to do is going to be around PowerPoint tips or any other slide software that are out there. Obviously, there is more than one. And then I'll finish up with some tips on what to expect when you're actually presenting at one of the Connect events. I'll round that off with a summary, and then we'll go into a Q&A session at the end. Now, the way these webinars work is effectively, I'm the only one who can actually speak. We do have two other people on the call as part of the committee who can speak and interact if needs be, but none of the general attendees can actually speak and interact with me directly. So if you do have any questions as we go through the presentation, use the chat box that's on available to you to type in those questions. The other two attendees, Tora and Michael, will be monitoring that chat box. I'll try and monitor it as well. If there's anything I see in the chat box that I can answer immediately as I'm going through, I'll try and do that. But if not, I will then go through those questions when we get to the very end in the Q&A session. Okay, so let's get into the first item, which is the preparation. So in general, before you get to actually interact with your slide production, obviously it's a good idea to prepare properly. And by that I mean, you've got to know your topic, you've got to do your research. In terms of the Connect events, what we ask you to do is produce a paper. So part of that preparation is to go through all that process of generating, getting your ideas together, preparing your paper, and then looking to put your presentation together. Some people like to do it the other way around and put their presentation together and then write their paper. Nothing wrong with that. But the point I'm trying to make here is before you even touch PowerPoint, you need to have a general idea of what your story is going to be. So you need to have come up with your general overview of what your story is. And it's always a good idea just to keep that from a PowerPoint presentation point of view, keep that simple, perhaps have 3 or 4 main messages from your paper that you're going to cover in your presentation. You should always remember that at the conference, the presentation is essentially a summary of your paper, and all your details should be in your paper. Your presentation should get the audience interested in what you have to say, and then they should check out your paper for further information and more details if they are that interested. So this is the first example of this real highlighting, traffic lighting that I was just mentioning earlier on. So on first glance, this slide seems okay. I'm talking about preparing your slides. I'm not going to go through all these points here because I'm going to present them in a slightly better way in the next set of slides. But it looks okay. There's bullet points, there's some images, but it's a little crowded. There's a lot of information there. So there's a better way of doing this. First thing is to keep your slides simple. And by that, I mean, you need to have one idea that you're going to present on your slides per slide set. And I'm going to call it slide set rather than one individual slide in your PowerPoint, because your ideas could span multiple animations within that, but have one idea that you're trying to present and don't put too much detail into it. As I said, your paper is where your detail should be. Keep it simple, present to the audience. It means that they're not distracted. They can focus on what you're saying. They get the general idea from your slide, and you as the presenter can talk over the slide and give them the general idea of the ideas that you're presenting. Second element is obviously you need to be credible. The audience need to believe what you're saying to them. And a big part of that is doing your preparation work. As I said earlier, you need to know your content, but you also need to make it relevant. So there's no point in, for example, as I put up here, an image of information from the PhUSE working groups. There's no point in putting that into your presentation if you're not really going to talk about it, or you're not prepared to answer any questions that the audience might have about the PhUSE working groups. So obviously you need to know that information. Don't put in anything in there that's not relevant to your presentation itself. And try to use practical examples. So again, if I was to present on the PhUSE working groups, I should have information to hand that I'm going to talk about that's very practical to what the groups are doing, what the deliverables are, and give specific examples around that. Next thing about preparing is reviewing your slides. You can put them all together as much as you want. One of the most important things to do before you actually get to the stage of finalizing your slides is to review them in terms of spell checks, but also to proofread them. So you can see here I've highlighted that spell check will highlight the misspellings, but it won't necessarily see that the word cheek is wrong here. What it really should be is check. So you need to both spell check and proofread in order to correct those particular types of mistakes. It's also a very good idea to involve others in doing that for you, and particularly if you're not a native English speaker and you may not pick up on particular nuances in the way you're saying things or you have things on your slide. Try and involve a native English speaker in that review process. It's a good idea as well to rehearse your slides. Make sure you've got a good flow or a good understanding of the flow of the slides and how long it actually takes you to get through them. But not only rehearsing your slides by yourself, but also practice in front of other people And ideally, people who are not necessarily your reviewers, because they've already seen those slides and they won't necessarily pick things up for you. The people that you practice in front of can give you a good insight on, are you coming across correctly? Are your ideas coming across correctly? They may give you tips on the way your presentation style is. I'm not going to cover anything specifically regarding actual presentation style. There's lots of material available on the internet for you to look up about how to present properly. I'm particularly concerned here about the practical aspects of what your slides should look like in terms of the production value of those slides. But use others to help you with anything that you're not particularly familiar with. Okay, so in terms of structure next, there's a common saying, I think most people will have heard this before, and I'm just going to go through it again, which is you start off your slides by saying what you're going to say. You tell people, this is what you've come for, this is what I'm going to talk about. And then following on from that, the bulk of your presentation is going to be you telling them your messages, your ideas. Now, there's a couple of things to keep in mind here. As you are going through that, you generally will have, say, a 20-minute presentation. People forget things very quickly. There is a study, or a thing called the forgetting curve, which was a study by a guy called Hermann Ebbinghaus, where he analyzed, how quickly people forget information that they've just seen. And there's been many other studies about this since then. But basically, 40% of what you tell people, they will forget within 20 minutes. 60% is gone within half a day, and then 90% is gone within a week. So what you need to do as you're going through your presentation is try and reinforce your messages. Keep repeating what you're saying, get that information into people so that they have a better chance of remembering long after they've left the presentation. Just a caveat on that is that you don't want to over repeat yourself, because then it becomes slightly annoying or slightly boring for people in the audience. So you need to have a balance between the messages you're trying to get across and making sure that people remember the key points at the end of it. And then you finish up with saying exactly what you just said. So again, it's just another form of repeating. You start with you tell them what you're going to say, you tell them it, and then at the end, you say exactly what you just said, and then they can go away happy, hopefully. Next element of structure is timing. Typically your presentation, and I'll come on to more details about this later on, but typically your presentation at the Connect events lasts for about 20 minutes. So you might be wondering, well, how many slides should I have for a 20-minute presentation? And that's kind of the wrong way of looking at it. What you should be focusing on is, how many messages do I want to include in that 20-minute presentation, not the number of slides that you need to get those messages across. I've kind of hinted at this already, that you shouldn't consider a slide as one physical slide in a PowerPoint presentation, but rather think of it as a number of slides for one particular message. And you should be counting those slide sets as based on the messages you're trying to convey. And a general rule is 1 or 2 minutes per slide, or per key point, or per message, whatever terminology you want to use around that. So how does this fit into the Connect events themselves? Well, we essentially have 3 types of slots in the Connect event. There's the specific ones for coding tips and tricks, which is a 15-minute slot. And within that, you have an 8-minute presentation. You have 2 minutes for questions and answers at the end of that presentation. And then there's a 5-minute turnaround changeover time for people to get in and out of the room and so on. The bulk of the presentations at these events are 30-minute slots. So that's probably more or less what most of you people will be working towards. That's a 20-minute presentation, 5 minutes for Q&A, 5 minutes for turnover. And then for the 60-minute presentations, you more or less just double the time before, 40 minutes for presentation, 10 minutes for Q&A, 10 minutes for turnover. So what does that look like in real terms or in the actual sequence of events. I mentioned earlier on that I hadn't introduced myself properly. I'm going to talk about the way we do this now at the Connect events. We will have an introduction slide rather than the stream chairs standing up and introducing each presenter directly to the audience. We will have an introduction slide that will serve that purpose, that will be shown prior to everybody's presentation. So in that turnover time from previous presentation to the next one, your particular introduction slide will be there on the screen. You do not have to produce this. This will be done by the stream chairs, but you will have to provide input into that introduction itself. So then you get up and you do your presentation. So for the 30-minute slot, as I said before, 20 minutes for your presentation. It's important that you stick exactly to the time. You don't want to be finishing early, but equally you don't want to be finishing late. And to help you with that, we have what we call the time remaining or countdown cards. And one of the stream chairs will show these to you as you go through your presentation. So with 10 minutes remaining, 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute, and then stop. And it's a good idea as you're going through that to acknowledge those cards, but you can also use that to keep track of where you are within your presentation. If you've rehearsed properly, you should know exactly where you should be with 10 minutes remaining. And then you can adjust the speed that you're actually presenting at to accommodate whatever that time happens to be. So if you're still on slide 1 with 10 minutes to go, then you really need to speed up. I mean, you're not going to make the rest of your slides in 20 minutes if that's the case. So just be aware of that when you're practicing. You know, timing yourself is very important, and the countdown cards will also assist you in dealing with that. If you do go over and you don't finish when we say stop, then drastic things can happen. But once you finish with that, we then go into Q&A. And here's where things can vary slightly. So for example, if you go over your time, if you go to 21 minutes, that's not a problem. It just means your Q&A comes down to 4 minutes. This is where we adjust. So it doesn't have to be dead on 20 minutes, but as close to it as you possibly can. And then the final element of it is where the turnaround time, you leave the stage, the next presenter gets ready for the stage, we put up their introduction slide, the audience moves in and out of the room, so we get prepared for the next presentation. In terms of content then of a typical presentation, I've already said the introduction slide. Again, I'll come on to that later on in the session when I give you an example of my introduction slide. But then what you need to prepare is your beginning slide, your title slide with your paper title and number and your author details. A disclaimer slide if your company requires that, that's fine. An agenda, and it's a good idea then when you have an agenda is to repeat that throughout your presentation to signal that you've finished one section and you're moving on to the next one. Obviously, the bulk of your presentation is going to be your content, and then finish up with a summary slide or set of slides. If you've made any references throughout your presentation, it's a good idea to have a reference slide so that your audience can take note of that and follow up afterwards. And then finish off with a slide that provides your contact information and also prompts the audience to say, we're now moving into the question and answers phase. Okay, so this is the next section now is going to be my tips. And again, as I think I said earlier, I'm not saying these are the ways you should do things. I'm presenting options for you, things that I think work well and should help you in your presentation. Sorry, just before I start on this, as I introduce these tips, I will then try and incorporate those into the rest of my presentation. So the first section that we just gone through doesn't necessarily include any of these tips that I'm now about to go through. But from now on in, I should then be including those. So you should see the presentation change and get slightly more consistent with the tips that I'm presenting. And the first one is what I'm calling progressive reveals. And that's where there's nothing else on the screen because I haven't gotten to it yet. I'm talking about progressive reveals because I'm revealing the elements one by one. And what's also useful is as I've introduced an element and move on to the next one, is to gray it out, the previous one out, so it becomes defocused and the audience see, okay, I've now moved on to the next point and this is what I'm going to be talking about. So there's no confusion from the audience point of view. They don't have a full set of information on the screen that they can be reading, and in fact reading ahead of you. You're keeping their focus on the item that you're particularly talking about. Another way of emphasizing items is by size. So very simple, just increase the font size. And that implies that this is more important than everything else that's on the screen. Similarly, you can draw people's attention to differences in the way you're actually presenting things like bullet points. So using a tick mark, different color, again, draws the attention to those particular differences from what you've done previously. You can also use color to imply something that's more important. And you can use things like animations or surprises to attract attention to particular areas of the screen. But just be careful with this, because if you have too much, you're going to distract attention. You don't know where to be looking, what's going on here. Too many animations, not particularly a good way of doing things. So next element I want to look at is fonts. And in terms of fonts, there are, I won't say conflicting views available on the internet, but there are some common areas that people tend to say, and that is that the likes of a serif font, which is what you're looking at here in terms of Times New Roman, it can be difficult to read for some people. What's better is the sans serif fonts. They're much more straightforward and therefore easier to read than the serif fonts themselves. Non-proportional fonts like the SAS monospace font, which is generally used for program code, that's usually a good choice for when you want to distinguish between the general text on the screen and actual code that you're presenting for example. Italics and underline are generally difficult to read on the screen, so I would advise you not to use them, or to use them very sparingly in what you're presenting. You can use bold, you can use color, as I've mentioned earlier, to provide particular focus. But try not to combine bad options. So, bold or italics and underline together is definitely not a good idea. So once you get those basic stuff sorted out in terms of the font you want to use, the emphasis you want to place on things, what should you do with text? Well, it's generally considered a good idea to keep it short. What you don't want to do is have all the text that you're actually going to talk about and say on the screen at the same time, because your audience, what they will do is they will read that text much quicker than you can actually say it. So their focus is gone and moved on to something else by the time you actually get to elaborate your point. So your text should form a starting point, the basis for what you are about to say, and so it should form, if you like, a background for you to actually talk about that particular item. Also, it's not a good idea to use multiple colors. Again, it's just distracting. Similarly, using multiple fonts is completely distracting. Pick 2 fonts that you're going to use throughout your presentation. 2 or 3 at max, and use them in a consistent way to emphasize one style over another. And try to avoid all capitals. These are difficult to read when you compare them to normal sentence case. But they also have a general, in terms of social media, today's social media, they also have a general meaning of shouting at people. So it's considered not a good idea to use all capitals anymore. In terms of animations, please don't do anything silly. It's just distracting. Again, your slide should be the beginning point of your presentation. So it shouldn't be taking focus away from you. You are the presenter. The audience focus should be on you, not on what's happening on the slide. And you should use text in conjunction with your graphs and your images to highlight or to support, if you like, the items that you're going to present in terms of the images and graphs. So a quick example of what isn't a great idea, just far too much text here. If I was to give a presentation on PhUSE, what is PhUSE? And then I started talking about this particular slide, the audience will have read this straight away and they will have gotten the idea. There's no point in me continuing talking because I'm not going to necessarily add much more than what's on the slide here. So a better way of doing it is to be more visual. So put up a graph or an image like this, which gives a clear indication like PhUSE is global, that we deal with lots of organizations. You can then talk about the fact that it's an independent society run by volunteers. And the key messages, as you can see, because of the differentiation here in the bullet points, is PhUSE is all about connect, share, and advance. So that's up there on the screen. The audience gets it straight away. And now I can spend, as a presenter, I can spend whatever length of time I want talking about those key elements to get the information across of exactly what PhUSE is. In terms of bullet points, then, this is a fairly common rule now that, again, 6x6 or 6x7 basically says no more than 6 bullet points on a slide and no more than 6 or 7 words per bullet point. Anything more than that is just too much information. The audience loses focus, and you should probably, it's probably going to stray into that area of you've got more than one idea on the slide, and therefore you should split it out and put 3 on one slide and 3 on the other. Also, it's a good idea to use bullets rather than numbers. It's just easier to follow, and numbers have a specific meaning and a specific place. So I'll just, in terms of actual numbers, they always imply order or sequence. So step 1, step 2, step 3, or top priority, second priority, third priority, or whatever. In terms of readability, then, this is a common mistake that people make, is putting text on the slide that is just not readable by everybody that they're presenting to. As you put your slides together, you are sitting in front of your own laptop or desktop, so you're no more than a couple of feet or less than a meter away from the screen, and what looks good to you isn't necessarily going to look good to people that are sitting in the back of the audience in whatever room you're presenting in. So the key point about readability is to make it big. In the past, I've used 18 points as a minimum. In researching this presentation, I've been convinced that 18 points is probably too small for a number of reasons. So what I'm saying now is 24 points probably should be the minimum, and more than that is better. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a consensus in the material that you can find on the internet as to what the minimum point size should be. I've seen 24 points, I've seen 30 points, I've seen 36 points. But there is another way of dealing with that, and that's to use what's called the 8H rule. And the 8H rule has a little bit more to it than simply what I have on the screen here, which is to stand back 8 times the height on the screen. But it's a very quick way of checking yourself rather than going into the details of the 8H rule to find out exactly how to work it out. You simply need to look to stand back 8 times the height of your image, the height of the image that you use on your screen, to check whether you can read the text that you have there. If you can't read it, then you need to increase the point size. Now, what does that mean in practical terms? Well, this is a fairly typical conference room setup where you will have people who not only have to try and see around the heads of the people in front of them, but they may be at the back of the room and they need to be able to see exactly what's on the slide itself. So the 8H rule basically says that what's the height of the image, and by image I mean the projected size rather than the actual size of the screen that you're seeing here. So if it's smaller than the height of the actual physical screen, you need to take that into account. But if you work out that 8 times that height is about as far as you can get in terms of whether your slide content is going to be readable or not, and so long as you have checked that by stepping back from your laptop by 8 times its height, then you can be reasonably comfortable that people at the back of the room can read your slides. Now, that's not always going to be the case, but I think it's an average, and I think it works quite well in most conference rooms. Okay, so we have color as our next slides. There is a number of elements to do with colors and contrast that I want to cover. This is a color wheel. The primary color is red, green, and blue. If you try and mix that in terms of text and background, you get varying degrees of success depending on the colors that you pick. Now, you may not be able to read this purposely because the colors that I picked for this example are very similar. So, for example, on the red box, I have orange color. So they're beside each other in the color wheel. For the next one down, green, I have yellow. And for blue, I have just another slight variation on blue. They're too close to each other on the color wheel and therefore don't work well on the slide. The best way to do it is to pick a color that's opposite on the color wheel. So for red, you want to pick kind of a light green. For green, you want to pick one of the pink colors or the moles. For blue, yellow works quite well. This is an example of something that just doesn't work well. This is bad choices all around. There's nothing wrong with the background color, that's fine, but you need to pick all the other colors to suit. So in this particular case, the colors are completely bad. There's nothing readable in terms of the slide here. So a better choice is to adjust everything based on the contrasts that you might work out on the color wheel. Now, there's two elements to this that I've come across online. One is whether you should have light content on a dark background or dark content on a light background. And I'm just going to illustrate the differences between the two. So in terms of light on dark, yellow on a black background is one of the best contrasting colors. Gray on black, not so good in terms of highlighting things, but it's great for when you want to de-emphasize things, as I've been showing you earlier on in the progressive reveal. And ugly is just ugly. Stay away from that. What's interesting here is for the particular graph that I have, without actually changing any of the text or any of the colors or anything else to do with this graph, as soon as I switch to a light background, that graph changes. The reason being that the contrast between the white background and the content of the graph highlights the colors and the effect of that particular graph. So I'm hoping you were able to see that. Let me go back again. So it looks kind of dull there, I think. But then when you go onto a light background, it kind of pops a little bit better, and without actually changing any of the colors. And here on a dark text on a light background, obviously dark text is good, yellow and white is bad, and ugly is still ugly. Okay, the next thing is animations. I think a common theme that I'm trying to portray throughout the presentation is if you're doing something, keep it simple. One of the most easiest animations to do is use the appear and disappear animations. They're the simplest ones. If you're going to use more than that, then please limit the number, because if you put in too many animation types, you're just confusing people. But whatever you do, you need to be consistent with what your choices are, and really only animate when it actually adds value. So again, an example of something that doesn't work is multiple animations trying to achieve something that really just confuses, whereas simple set of animations illustrates the point of the 8H rule a lot easier and a lot better. Next section I'm going to cover is representing tables, graphs, and images. So if you look at a table, typically if you've got lots of information, you're going to run into this problem of not being able to make the table big enough to be readable. So various ways of dealing with that is, split the table in two, have two sections beside each other. That gets the text slightly bigger. You still got problems with colors in this particular case. So you could then make the table even bigger, change the colors. But what you then run into is having too much information available for the audience. So again, there's a lot of stuff here that is just distracting for when you're trying to talk about whatever your message you're trying to convey. So a better way of dealing with it is, again, going back to this idea of the progressive reveal. Just highlight the information in the table that you want to talk about, and then you can use the progressive reveal animations to move the audience's focus to the next section that you're then going to talk about. Similarly with graphs, too much information on the graph. There's a table on the bottom. There's two axes highlighted. There's trend lines in there. A lot of it isn't probably readable for people. It's just too much. So again, simplify it. Keep it simple. Get rid of the axes. Get rid of the data table. Make it bigger. It's easier to deal with. Images, same. Things are too small here. These are images in terms of screen captures or images from the PhUSE membership brochure that I pulled in. These are things that I haven't prepared myself, let me put you that way, but I've just captured them as images. And what you need to be aware of with the image is it needs to be of sufficient quality when you capture it, so that when you increase its size to make it readable, it's still sharp enough and it's not blurred or fuzzy. Again, increasing the size of the PhUSE membership information, there's only so much you can do in terms of the screen size. So one thing you can do in order to be able to still read text that's not readable is to utilize the zoom function in PowerPoint, which enables you to go into greater detail in areas of the slide and move around. So again, familiarize yourself with being able to do that within PowerPoint, and that's quite handy as well. Okay, we're getting towards the end there. The next section is just a couple of tips on what to expect when you're actually presenting. But before you get there, before you get to actually do the presentation, a couple of things that the stream chairs need from you, which is your biography, your introduction text for the intro slide, the final versions of your presentations. Please don't come with last minute updates. They cause issues in terms of making sure everything is correct. So get your final versions to the stream chairs in time. Have a couple of sample questions prepared, and again, get them to the stream chairs. The idea behind this is to have a couple of questions ready when you're finished so that the audience gets prompted to actually start asking questions. Sometimes audiences can be a bit reluctant to be the first person to ask a question. If the stream chairs ask a sample question, that tends to kickstart everything and you get lots more questions following on from that. And make sure you've made the stream chairs aware of any specific requirements that you might have. Don't turn up on the day and tell them that you need internet access, because that just will not work. So I've said this earlier on. Here's my sample introduction slide for who I am. It's got a short little piece of text about me. I've many years in the industry, in computer industry. I've been in the pharma industry since 2004. I've been with PhUSE since 2007. Currently chairing the data handling stream, and I'm also doing the speakers meeting on the Sunday of the European Connect events for the last number of years. So in terms of this year's event, you should attend the speakers meeting on the Sunday, and I'll be providing some additional information in terms of what will happen at the actual event itself. Okay, once that introduction slide is done, that's the stream chair's responsibility, you take over with your slides. And obviously this is going to be in your company format with your information on it. It could be, I've been presenting in widescreen 16:9 format. Yours might be in standard 4:3. Your own company format dictates or can dictate the background colors that you have, the fonts that you use. So you've got to take the tips that I've been presenting here and, if you like, translate them into your own company standard and whatever mechanism they have for having a company template. In terms of your content, just to reiterate what I've said before, make sure you've spell checked and read your content. Make sure everything is readable, no blurred images, no small fonts. Have an appropriate number of slides that will fit the duration of the session that you're working in. Have permission if you have any copyright material included in your slides. The elements that I've been using in the presentation here, the clip art, has come from openclipart.com, which provides for free usage of material. Other sites would require any copyright material to be approved beforehand, and so on. So make sure you check that. Also, make sure that you're not producing a sales presentation. So we're going to be very careful about whether you're doing promotion of any commercial products or services of your own company. In terms of delivery, then, it's a good idea to memorize your opening. That gets you off to a very good start, and you deliver that in a better way if you have it memorized. But also use things like cue cards or notes to prompt you along the way as you're going through your presentation. Use conference English. So by this I mean trying to avoid using company-specific or any cultural type references. We are a multicultural organization. Not everybody is native English speaker. So you just need to be aware of that in terms of the elements that you use in your presentation. Try and speak clearly and naturally. You're going to be mic'd up, so you don't need to project your voice. But equally, you shouldn't really be whispering as well. So just speak in normal conversational tones. Very important is please do not read your slides. Your audience can do that for you. And as I said before, they will do it a lot quicker than you do. You are the presentation. You should be standing there. The focus should be on you, and you should be using your slides as a backup or as a backdrop and talking about the elements that are on your slides. And don't turn around and speak to the screen. Make sure you face your audience, make eye contact with them. And if anything goes wrong, then don't panic. Your stream chairs will help. Things that can happen that you may not be prepared for, which you should, in fact, just try and rehearse, is you may get questions throughout your presentation. It's up to you as to whether you stop your presentation and answer the question, or simply say you'll answer all questions at the end in the Q&A session. Equally, if in the Q&A session somebody asks a question and continues to ask follow-on questions, your stream chairs will probably step in and say, okay, can we move on to somebody else? So, there is that interaction there as well. So typical venues then, you usually have on, as you can see here on the right-hand side, there's a podium, there might be a table up the front, there's all the chairs laid out in front of you, projection system behind you. Your presentation will take place on the chair's laptop, so it's important to get that information, get the presentation to them prior to the conference. You will also have a presentation controller, which is a wireless handheld device. You can use that to control your presentation, so it's a good idea to try and practice with that beforehand. You can always use the keyboard of the actual laptop if that's your preference as well. But the advantage of having the presentation controller is there's a laser pointer on it, so you can use that to highlight your screen if you have an occasion to do that. And just to give you an idea of the microphones that are going to be there, obviously there's the podium microphone, which is going to be in the podium in front of you, and that if you're only using that, then you need to be aware of what happens. Obviously, if you move away from the podium, the microphone is not going to pick up what you're saying. So you need to stay close to or in directly behind the podium microphone. To alleviate that, we always supply the wireless transmitters, the microphones that you attach to your belt, or you put it in your pocket, and then you have it either attached as a clip onto a lapel or a tie or some part of clothing on, close to your head, or indeed you have the ones that you actually wear over your ears. We don't know this until we get to the actual conference venues as to what type is going to be there, but again, just be prepared that this is what you're going to expect. And then the other type is a handheld microphone, which is typically used by the stream chairs as we go through the Q&A sessions at the end. Another thing that's quite useful to look at is the PowerPoint presenter view option. Again, it's very useful to have a look at this, which for your own presentation. It presents you with a timing mechanism up here in the corner, where you can see where you are within your presentation. There are some other controls here. For example, when I zoomed in on the global membership graph, I use this control to be able to zoom in. It shows you the current screen and the position in the screen that you're on. It shows you the next slide that's going to come up. But I think this is probably the most important one, and this is the notes that you can put in there that you can use as cue cards for yourself to prompt you about the elements that you want to talk about. Okay, almost at the end. So just to summarize, in terms of your preparation, obviously you need to get everything together beforehand. You need to involve other people. You need to have a clear, simple structure. In terms of the presentations, I think it's best to have everything as big as possible, as simple as possible, and be consistent in terms of the effects that you use throughout the presentation. And finally, just remember that you are the presentation. You stand up there, you want the audience to focus on you. Your slides are your support, they're your backdrop. So use that. If you follow these tips, I think you should be able to convey that message to your audience. Or another way of putting it is, obviously there's a lot of people that go into helping you to get to where you are in terms of the actual presentation. You use their knowledge, their support, and their advice to stand up there, and they're not going to be on the stage with you, obviously, but they help you along the way to provide the general overview in terms of the message that I've been trying to convey in the presentation today. So finally, just to finish up with some references, the research that I did on this presentation involved a number of sources on the internet. There's plenty of stuff out there for you to go and look at, but the ones that I found most useful are the top two here are two videos. One is a TEDx video, and the second one there is a YouTube set of videos by Don McMillan, who's a comedian. It's a very funny video. I encourage everybody to check that out. And then the next one is Designing Effective PowerPoints by Victor Chen. A lot of the tips that I've included in the PowerPoint today have come from that particular presentation. And the others are just general guidelines that I found along the way I think they're quite useful. Okay, thank you everybody. I've gone a little bit longer than I had expected, so we'll hopefully try and get through some questions if there are any. Let me just see if we have it. Okay, I don't particularly see any questions. Michael, Tora, did you see any questions coming in?
No, John, I haven't seen any questions.
All right, so if anybody, I'll give people just 1 minute to type in any questions that they might have. Okay, so no questions from everybody. So thank you very much for attending today, and hopefully you'll take some encouragement from the presentation, and we will see everybody then at the conference event later on this year. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, John.